Hi, I'm Lydia McCoy. I'm president of the board of directors of the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network, and it's such a pleasure to be with you all today to share our report, Good in Theory, Problems in Practice. I want to tell you a little bit about YNPN in general. Our mission is to promote an effective, viable, and inclusive nonprofit sector that supports the growth, learning, and development of young professionals. We do this through our partnerships with our many local chapters as well as sector leaders across the country. I wanted to give you an overview of YNPN nationally. The first chapter was founded in 1997, and YNPN National incorporated in 2004. So we actually were not the first chapter for the umbrella. There were some local chapters that began before YNPN National, and YNPN National was formed in order to support the network nationally. So knowing that nonprofit professionals are not just staying in one city for their entire careers, making sure that we can be that connection point between different chapters across the country. We have 34 chapters right now. Some are very small, some are very large, and we have over 40,000 members nationally, which is a really strikingly high number when you think about the myth of the leadership gap, and then 40,000 people saying they are a part of emerging leadership in the nonprofit sector. The largest chapter is YNPN DC with 8,200 members. Our core membership ranges between about 26 and 30 years of age with 3 to 4 years in the sector. So generally, the core of our membership are not people who are right out of college who are looking for their first job. They're people who have been in their job a few years and want to build those connections and network. 7 of our chapters have their own 501c3s. Some other chapters have fiscal relationships with larger organizations, and others just function without a C3. And the average number of programs per month per chapter is 2. So as you can see, this is a really vibrant network of young professionals who are committing their personal time to professional development and creating community within the nonprofit sector. And I wanted to also offer a definition of emerging leaders. I think oftentimes we talk about leaders as being more seasoned and having more years of experience. And plenty of emerging leaders are also leaders currently. They are executive directors, they're CEOs, COOs, they're managing their development programs and other programs. So really emerging leaders is defined as under the age of 40. So this is about life and work experience. But it's not the only determining factor. So commitment to the nonprofit sector and a pursuit of leadership development are also determining factors. So not everybody that we're saying is in this age range is necessarily an emerging leader. These are people who have really committed themselves to creating a network to lead the sector into our future. So why this report? YNPN undertook this bear of an undertaking in order to chime in with our voice around some of the issues and solutions for emerging leadership in the nonprofit sector. Oftentimes, reports are put out by people who well, let me start. I'm going to start over this slide. So why this report? Why did YNPN pursue the research and the analyzation of data around what is the perspective of the young nonprofit professional? A lot of the research that we've heard in the last decade has been around this leadership gap and the threat that we have around not enough leaders being prepared to step into the roles, particularly as boomers retire. And oftentimes, sector leaders, chapter leaders across the country get questions around what do young nonprofit professionals think. And we didn't really have the data specifically around YNPN members, that 40,000 large membership, around what it was that was keeping them from committing to the sector fully, or what it was that was hampering their ability to do the best job that they could. So YNPN undertook this report to really be an answer and to offer some solutions to emerging leadership issues in the sector and making sure we have a very full pipeline of leadership that is connection from the emerging leadership to people who are in the roles that over the next 10 years they may be moving out of. We wanted to test some of the popular recommendations that you've likely read about or heard in the sector. And in reviewing the literature out there, we condensed them into these 5 recommendations that we wanted to test with our membership. One of them, the first, is nonprofits should offer more competitive compensation. The second being that nonprofits should invest in building bench strength, so that idea that people who are moving into higher level, director levels or executive level roles the people right below that pool that you can choose from to move into those roles. Nonprofits should engage in inclusive succession planning. So succession planning being the plan for when your executive leaves, having someone who's able to come in and fill that role relatively seamlessly. Nonprofits should prioritize diversity, and that can be obviously translated in different ways. Diversity can be socioeconomic, racial, gender, lots of different areas to work with there. And nonprofits should move away from traditional organizational structures and chief executive roles. So this is the idea that the structure, the hierarchical traditional structure, may need some adjustment. So here's a little information about our sample. We had over 1,800 respondents nationally to our survey. You can see from experience in education that we had a pretty broad representation. Most of our experience is in that 3 to 5 year range, as most of our membership, but we do have people 5 to 10 or over 10 years of experience. And this is a highly educated group of people. So more than half have a bachelor's degree, and then another 40% have a master's degree as well. We have a nice spread across the country for geographic location and response. The average age of respondent was 31 years old. Average annual salary was 35 to 50, is about 40% of our respondents. That's the range that they make, but also a nice curve there. Racial ethnic background, hugely weighted towards white people. I think this is a problem that reflects not only our membership, but in general the sector, as well as our gender representation of 80% female. So 80% female, mostly white, with some representation in other ethnic backgrounds. So the findings that we were able to conclude from our survey results were that the first finding, ideas are great, but only if they're implemented effectively. And this really became the theme for choosing the name for our report, Good in Theory, Problems in Practice, because there were a lot of great ideas, but for the most part, our membership didn't experience the impact of those ideas because they weren't either implemented effectively, they weren't implemented at all, or they weren't implemented with the input of the people that it was impacting. So that was one of our overarching findings, was if we're going to decide to pursue a specific intervention, be inclusive about the approach. The second finding is that structural change is underrated. I'll go into that in a little more detail. The third finding, competitive compensation is key, but a good manager can help. Being left out in the process of solving problems, but even pertaining directly to emerging leadership, is not uncommon. And the fifth finding, despite systemic challenges, we remain mission-driven. I'll go into these in a little more detail. So in finding number 2, that structural change is underrated. Only 50% of those surveyed rated structural change as a potentially high-impact intervention. But when implemented, structural change was the most effective strategy by far. So people who had experienced structural change in their organization, so people who had experienced a flatter hierarchy, leadership responsibility sharing, other structural changes that are different than the traditional hierarchy, they said it had a huge impact on, in a positive way, on the staff productivity and effectiveness of the organization. And it also increased their likelihood of committing to that organization for a long period of time. So although in a lot of ways that's a small piece of the population that's experienced that, overwhelmingly those people said it was a positive experience. And then when we tested this finding in our focus groups, we found that flatter organizations incentivized collaboration. They helped leaders push each other to improve and give new leaders opportunities to succeed in their roles. So emerging leaders were excited about new opportunities, trying out things that they hadn't been able to investigate before, as well as the sharing aspect that is commonly discussed with millennials and emerging leaders around pushing each other, working with each other to achieve greater things. So, so although a small percentage of our focus group had experience with these kind of flatter structures, again, people who had overwhelmingly thought it was a positive experience, and people who had not were interested in the possibility of pursuing that experience. One of the questions in the survey asked respondents to allocate resources to certain interventions. We asked them to play the role of program officer and look at various options and invest percentage of the $1 amount into different interventions. And what we heard was that the greatest area of investment, should they make the choice, was in compensation and bench strength. However, one thing that we also really want to point out is that although investment in compensation, increasing compensation, and also giving more opportunities for people to move up into those executive level roles when the time is appropriate is important, it is also important that they have a good manager, someone who's leading them and is invested in them personally in their professional development. So although competitive compensation is certainly an issue in the sector, we heard from our respondents that having a good manager was almost as important. Ideally, they have both. But if you're not able to give an emerging leader a competitive salary, at least give them the intangibles around managing and leading them towards the next step in their career. Some of the reflections of what we heard from respondents around their dedication to a nonprofit career is, I don't think, surprising to a lot of people. Only 50% surveyed plan to stay in the sector for the next 5 years. Only 30% committed to a nonprofit career over the lifespan of their career, but 70% were committed to a mission-driven career. And this really was a reflection of the acknowledgement that the nonprofit sector doesn't corner the market on doing good as a job anymore. So although people were really dedicated to making a difference in their communities, feeling good about the job they're going to day in, day out, they recognize that a 501c3 status is not the only option if they wanted to pursue that career. So our fourth finding is that being left out is not uncommon. So 20% of those surveyed whose organizations had implemented one of these strategies or interventions was not involved in the development or implementation of the strategy. So this strategy was intended to impact the emerging leaders in the organization, but they weren't involved at all in putting that strategy together or implementing it. So there was a disconnect between the goals and the people that they engaged in the process. There's oftentimes a top-down style of communication that adds to frustrations. So rather than engaging people in discussions, emerging leaders felt that changes were thrust upon them without any discussion. Of course, there's always a tension between certain times. Executive leadership is not going to share the process with people, but this is our respondents' response, was that sometimes that could be a frustrating experience. And there is also a response that diversity was a priority as a face value. Generally, people prioritized diversity. They knew it was important, but it wasn't engaged in the process in a really authentic way when it came to soliciting diverse opinions in the process. In response to the key findings, we created recommendations for sector leaders to strengthen the pipeline of leadership within the nonprofit sector. Our first category is for nonprofit executives. And I do want to remind you that these are not only people who have been working in the sector for 10 to 20 years, these are also sometimes emerging leaders. I myself had an experience being an executive director of forgetting some of these same tenets with my staff. Even though I'm the chair of the board of YNPN, it's easy to forget that emerging leaders do need tending if they're going to become tomorrow's leaders. So the recommendation is that we consistently and appropriately involve young professionals. We can do this by developing the staff as a key stakeholder, so acknowledging that they are dedicated to the mission. They're not just there as assets and resources for the organization, but they are the public face of our organization in a lot of circles. And making sure that they feel engaged in the strategic vision of the organization, and as well as we would with any community member, that we want to feel a part of what we're doing. Provide informal, easy to implement opportunities for two-way communication. So emerging leaders are really looking for opportunities to have a discussion with their executive directors around what is the future, ideas that they have. They have a lot of great ideas, and I know sometimes that can be overwhelming, but having an opportunity for two-way dialogue can be huge. Open door policies are something that are really appreciated by emerging leaders. Our respondents said when they can have that back and forth and share ideas and also maybe understand why the ideas can't be implemented, it's so much more productive of a use of time than feeling like they're the ones at staff meetings always asking for change. So having an open door policy where you can have regular communication with emerging leaders makes a big difference in their investment in the organization. And sharing insight into decision making. So of course there are times when it's not going to be appropriate to share details around decision making with staff, but to whatever extent you can, it's a great development opportunity for emerging leaders to understand how and why decisions are made at the executive level. And this is something that by observing, they can put into practice later on. Recommendations that we made for emerging leaders is that we ask them to bring high-impact ideas to your organizations. We also have a caveat that we want them to understand the context before suggesting a solution. So emerging leaders oftentimes are highly motivated to make an impact. They have great ideas, they want to work on the team, and some of those ideas could be easily implementable. Others may not be, and we encourage emerging leaders to understand why that might be the case before jumping in with a solution. So before saying, I've got an idea, I'm going to run with it, ask more questions, and this is where that open door policy can come into place. Ask more questions about understanding the full color of the issue before suggesting a solution, and not making assumptions that people haven't already thought the process that you yourself are. Leveraging relationships, so making sure that you have strong relationships with your direct managers, your colleagues. That's going to go a long way in when you do have something that you have a suggestion around changing or a new idea you'd like to implement. If you have a strong relationship and people understand that you're dedicated to the organization, that's going to serve you well. And then be a partner. So rather than feeling like I'm in this place and no one appreciates me and I have all these great ideas that no one listens to, consider that you are one piece of this organization and all of you together working towards a common goal and trying to affect positive change on your communities. So be a partner with the people that you work with the boards that you work with. Approaching it from a partnership perspective will be the most productive way to suggest changes or to continue on currently effective path. Our recommendations for the funding community is that we invest in the leadership of an entire organization, not just the executive directors. Many executive directors, and I can speak personally to this, have opportunities for leadership development, management skills, lots of different opportunities for ways that I can build the skills and talents within my organization, but not as many for my staff. Often they're skill-based professional development opportunities, but not leadership-based. So we ask that funders take a long-term view on grantee sustainability, that supporting the leaders in their nonprofits that are in those mid-level managers is just as important as supporting the executive directors. And if we start investing in people in that mid-level, then we're going to be in such a much better position that day one when that person takes on an executive director role. We're preparing them for that role rather than waiting until they get in that role and then having them feel overwhelmed. And then we have a recommendation for all sector stakeholders that we develop talent as if they're your organization's next senior leaders. And this concept is around acknowledging that most nonprofits in the sector are small nonprofits. It's not reasonable to expect that every nonprofit is going to have a very clear pipeline or ladder that an emerging leader can grow into. That's a clear next step that they'll be satisfied with their next position. So knowing that a lot of nonprofits have a staff of 1 to 5, looking at developing talent as a cooperation, that we're all building this together. So if one nonprofit invests in their emerging leader and make sure they have opportunities for professional development and leadership opportunities, then when they move on to another organization, they're going to inherit someone who's had the same opportunities. So seeing this as a talent pool and embracing this flow of talent, that although small nonprofits are not going to be able to offer one emerging leader a 50-year career, that if all of us together invest in emerging leaders, we're all going to benefit from it. Because oftentimes this is the same pool of talent that's looking at their next opportunity and looking to expand their skill set. So, so this is more of a concept of how we approach talent in the sector, and speaking to sometimes the attitude of young people leave after 2 or 3 years, so why should I invest in them? And then you'll get someone who felt the same way. Their previous executive director felt like, why was I investing in that person? And then you have another person who's underdeveloped. We'll be stronger the stronger we all are together. We wanted to offer a few resources for the good and theory problems in practice. YNPN Twin Cities has several resources on their site around this report. They've done some outreach within their membership. It's pretty impressive. The YNPN national site, ynpn.org, you can download the report. You can download fact sheets, the recommendations, a lot of resources and tools that can help you connect with emerging leaders and build that pipeline. And then the Building Movement Project also has reports on structuring leadership and what works and growing emerging leadership that are really relevant and and helpful in building a program around emerging leadership. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to consider these issues. I think in the end, we feel really confident that the 40,000 members of YNPN are dedicated to improving their communities through social change, and they're looking for opportunities to engage, and we believe that the sector is peaked to take advantage of the talent that we have in the sector. Thank you.